because I think this is a powerful way to explain Israeli understanding of the conflict and Israeli confusion regarding the conflict. So let's start. Confusion happens. Over the past 2 decades, most Israelis went through a very similar process where they realized that what the right was always preaching about was right. And simultaneously, they started realizing that parts of what the left was always talking about is right also. Now, this confusion, what happens when you think that both sides, which contradict each other, they both got something right, that creates confusion. And that confusion created indifference. So I want to just follow very, very briefly. What did Israelis start understanding? So I want to start with I'll start with the right and then I'll move to the left, okay? So there were many arguments of the Israeli right which are rejected by mainstream Israelis. Like the argument that settlements are sacred, like the argument that settling Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, leads to redemption. All those utopian arguments and statements are completely rejected by the vast majority of Israelis. But there was one very powerful idea and argument always presented by the right that most Israelis completely buy. And it's the following argument: that if Israel leaves Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, it shrinks into borders that it can't protect itself from. Meaning a withdrawal from the West Bank dramatically risks Israeli national security. Now, in order to make this argument, I want you to imagine the map of Israel in the borders of the Green Line. You have it, I'm pretty sure you all. Now, think about the northern border, the northern Israel in the north. It's wide. When I say it's wide, I mean Israel, but not America wide. Israel, it's wide. It's 80 kilometers, okay? In the south, it's wide. In the middle, it's very narrow, right? The distance between the Green Line and the Mediterranean, it's very, very narrow. I'm thinking kilometers, I'm trying to translate to miles. I think it's 9 miles or 11 miles. I forgot the number. It's either 9 or, let's say 10 miles, okay? From Netanya, from Tulkarem to the Mediterranean, 10 miles, okay? Now, so right in the middle of Israel, on the borders of the Green Line, Israel is very narrow. But here's the problem. Where do most Israelis live? Most Israelis live in the center of Israel, close to the shore. So, Davka, I don't know how to say Davka in English. Precisely, or Davka, where Israel is most narrow, that's where most Israelis live. It's the most highest concentrated area in the world of Jews. It's completely against the vision of Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion wanted us to be spread out in the Negev, the Galil, and especially the Negev, to be spread out. But we decided, no, we're going to just, get, very claustrophobic. All Israelis concentrated, Petah Tikva, Rosh Ha'ain, Kfar Saba, Ra'anana, Netanya, Ramat Gan, Givatayim, Chulon, Bat Yam, Rishon, Tel Aviv, Yaf, all these, Israelis like to think these are all separate cities, right? Separate cities are different. Givatayim and Ramat Gan and Tel Aviv and Kiryat Onor and Bnei Brak, they're separate cities. But when you fly over it, it's just one big, gigantic, metropolis, that's how you pronounce it, I'm thinking in Hebrew, metropoline, yeah? And that's the highest concentration of Jews, and that's 60% of Israeli population, 70% of our economy, 70% of our culture, where Israel is most narrow. Now, so those are two facts that together create the geography of Israel. Where Israel is most narrow, that's where most people are. Most narrow within the Green Line borders. Now, that's geography. I want to move to history. 2 historic facts. History. 2005, 2011. This is where geography meets history. 2005, when Israel left Gaza, in 2005, about a year and a half later, Hamas took over Gaza. And ever since then, there's rockets periodically falling on communities that are roughly 10 miles away from Gaza. And the life in Sderot, as you all, I'm sure, know, is terrorized and horrible and not easy. Because even if a whole month passes without rockets, you never know when the day that the rocket, when a rocket falls a day a month, this is a very smart person still told me. When a rocket falls a day a month, you don't feel like it's a day a month. Every moment you feel like today that might be the day. So just think about the following thought experiment. Israel left Gaza and something happened, and all Israelis living 10 miles from Gaza are under constant threat of rockets. There's about 60,000 Israelis living in the periphery around Gaza. If Israel leaves Judea and Samaria, and all the Israelis that live roughly 10, 15 miles from Judea and Samaria would be threatened with rockets, how many Israelis would that be? Around Gaza, there's 60,000 Israelis. Around the West Bank, there's about 5-6 million Israelis. That's almost all of Israelis. Almost all of Israelis are, okay, so like David Makovsky said, we don't want to repeat what we did in Gaza in Judea and Samaria. That wouldn't be a smart move. That's what many Israelis are afraid of. Which takes me to a second important argument, which is very interesting. It comes from not the president of 2005, but the president of 2011. And this argument comes from Henry Kissinger, which was interviewed by Jeffrey Goldberg in the Atlantic magazine towards the end of 2016. And he presents something very interesting. He says, ever since 2011, what we call the Arab Spring, where forces of chaos were unleashed in the Middle East, and a lot of horrible things have been happening in the Middle East ever since. Kissinger said it's like an earthquake. Now, in an earthquake, when the land shakes, every building that's not very safe collapses, right? That's what happens in a massive earthquake. Buildings are not very stable, collapse. Well, ever since 2011, there's a geopolitical earthquake in the Middle East. And every country that's not very stable collapsed. In an earthquake, buildings are unstable, collapse. In a geopolitical earthquake, countries collapse if they're not stable. That included 2 revolutions in Egypt. Yemen collapsed, torn apart. Libya, torn apart. Iraq, chaos. Syria, which is Gehinnom. We should pray for the people of Syria. They're just going, it's hell. Yes, it's Gehinnom. And all this is happening simultaneously. So this is what Henry Kissinger has asked. Is this a time to create a new nation state, a Palestinian nation state? Is this the right time? When nation states are being torn apart? Now, if the forces of chaos that ripped apart countries we thought were stable, had political, healthy, stable political traditions, like Libya and Yemen and Syria and Iraq, and they collapsed, will a new Palestine survive? And what if it won't? What if it will collapse too, or become dysfunctional, or not very sovereign, because proxies of Iran will enter, or Hamas, like in Gaza, or ISIS, or Al-Qaeda, like Putin, or as Israeli intelligence told me, like a cocktail of all those forces? What will happen? The forces of chaos will enter the Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. What will happen? So those forces of chaos will be right next to Tel Aviv and spill in to the highest concentration of Jews in the world. I find this argument so interesting, because if anybody knows the classic arguments of right-wingers, it sounds like this. A strong Palestine will threaten Israel. Well, the new argument is that a weak Palestine, a chaotic Palestine, and not sovereign enough Palestine will threaten Israel. Not a strong Palestine, a weak Palestine will threaten Israel. Now, these are very persuasive arguments. Now, if you put together geography and history, the fact that most Israelis live where it's most narrow, that's geography, and you listen to 2005, withdrawal from Gaza, 2011, nation states collapsing, and you say, when geography meets history, the conclusion is we can't leave the West Bank, let's stay there, it's not safe, okay? Now, these arguments are very persuasive. I hope some of you feel like these arguments have power. Most Israelis are persuaded by these arguments. Maskana, conclusion, we have to stay in the West Bank. The problem is, also the left understood something. And also the left got something right. They got a lot of things right. And I won't go through all the powerful arguments of the left. There's a very important ethical argument of the left, which many Israelis find powerful, especially the Zionist version of the ethical argument, because military regime controlling civilian population means that Israel as a nation is controlling another nation or robbing the liberty of another nation. Now that's not ethical, it's not Jewish, and it's also not Zionism. Why is it not Zionism? Because Zionism is founded on a few principles, I think 2 principles: security for the Jewish people and liberty for the Jewish people, right? That's a whole idea. After World War I, this idea was born that nations deserve states. Nations should govern themselves. Nations shouldn't be governed by empires of foreign nations. Nations should be liberated. Nations should govern themselves. That's a very important principle. Born in World War I, that principle gave birth to Zionism into Israel. We're a nation, and like any nation, we should govern ourselves, control our own lives. So if liberty for nations is a principle and the foundation of Zionism, a Zionism that occupies the Palestinians is anti-Zionism. Are you following this argument? What I'm arguing is that the ethical argument is a Zionist argument. The ethical argument and the Zionist argument don't contrast. The ethical argument is a Zionist argument. If Zionism that robs Palestinians from their national rights is anti-Zionism. Zionists founded, I don't have an audience live, so I can't see your faces and see if you got it. Let me just say this again. If that's why on Zoom you have to repeat because you're not really sure, but this is so sensitive. Let me just say it again. If Zionism is founded on the idea of liberation of nations, and we're one of those nations, so we should be liberated, a Zionism that's about liberation for nations that controls another nation is a contradiction in terms. That's why the ethical argument is not in contrast to the Zionist argument. It is the Zionist argument for withdrawal from the West Bank. That's an important argument. There's a second argument, a diplomatic argument, that if Israel continues controlling the Palestinians in the West Bank, Israel will be isolated in the world. That's a diplomatic argument. I won't go into it. It's complicated. But the most important argument that persuades Israelis is what we call the demographic argument. And it's a very clear argument. I'll make it very clearly. The idea that Zionism is about having a nation state for the Jewish people. But in order to have a nation state, which is also democratic for the Jewish people, we need to have a clear majority, a massive majority. That's what Herzl spoke about. That's what Zev Jabotinsky was speaking about. That's what Ben Gurion was dreaming about. We have a country, a state with a massive majority. What happens if we start annexing parts of the West Bank? What happens if we continue the status quo in the West Bank? Eventually, the Palestinian Authority, with high probability, will collapse. And between 2.5 or 3 billion Palestinians are living in the West Bank will be absorbed to Israel. And we have 2.5 to 3 Palestinians absorbed into Israel. We don't have a massive majority anymore. We're close to losing our majority. We're not the nation state of the Jewish people anymore. We're a binational state, like Yugoslavia, like Bosnia, like Lebanon, like all these experiments that when nations that are hostile to each other are in the same state. It doesn't work. It's definitely the end of Zionism and of Israel as we love it, as we want it, as we're willing to fight for it. So if we stay in the West Bank, we're turning our back to our ethical values, our Zionist values, and we're threatening our national majority, which means we have to leave the West Bank if we want to be who we want to be and have a future. We have to leave the West Bank. Now, this is so persuasive, and most Israelis on different levels are persuaded by this argument. Now, when I say this, there's polls after polls. There's the last poll I was involved in, the committee that was around it. 70% of Israelis say something like, if we stay in the West Bank, we're risking our national majority. We have to leave. And most Israelis think that if we leave the West Bank, we're risking our national security. We have to stay. So if you stay in the West Bank, you're risking your future. You're definitely risking your future if you stay in the West Bank. If you leave the West Bank, you're definitely risking your future. Okay, that situation on so many levels is so confusing. People on the right that say, hey, we could stay in the West Bank, nothing bad will happen, it's the right thing to do, they're not confused. people on the deep left that say we could leave the West Bank and everything will be okay. Because, I don't know, the international community will guarantee our security and everything will be, what happened in 2005 won't repeat itself. Just don't worry, it's okay. People, they're not confused, that's great. But most Israelis are. Now, this is an interesting brand of centrist and being centrist. Most centrists in the world are somehow between right and left. Israeli brand of centrist is simultaneously right and left. That's most Israelis. Don't be confused. I mean, most Israelis are confused. Most Israelis don't vote for centrist parties, but most Israelis regarding the conflict are centrists in the sense that they're not between right and left, they're simultaneously right and left, and as a result, they're confused. How did Israelis respond to this new confusion? How did Israelis respond? Well, something like this. Something like this. They said, well, if we stay in the West Bank, it's a bad idea. It's not who we are, it's not our values, and it threatens our majority, and we can't stay in the West Bank. If we leave the West Bank, it's a bad idea. We saw what happened when we left Gaza. We're seeing what's happening all over the Middle East. If we leave the West Bank, it's a bad idea. So what should we do? Okay, screw it. In a sense that we stop thinking about this issue. When we reach the catch, it's not a catch 22, it's a catch 67. When we realize that there's not like, so most Israelis just stopped thinking about this issue. They started thinking about many other issues, but not this issue. We changed the issue, the conversation. And as a result, the deep right is still in the conversation. The deep left is still in the conversation. But most of the people just neglected the conversation. And that's how the process of discovering the light of both sides created confusion. Confusion created indifference. Indifference, which is something we know about for many years, leads to only 4% of Israelis caring about the annexation. Okay, that was another spiel of how Israeli indifference regarding annexation reflects something very deep happening in Israel. Chaos leads, why lack of certainty leads to indifference, right? You don't know what to do, so you just don't think about it anymore. But it's not healthy, because in Israel, if being a centrist means I don't care about the issue, it means that there's not a really centrist worldview about the issue, right? The right has a right-wing worldview. The left has a left-wing worldview. The center doesn't have a centrist worldview. It just doesn't have a worldview. Rabbi, I think what I just said captures Israeli politics and what's not healthy about Israeli politics. Most Israelis identify with the center. They like the word center in their identity. I'm center left, center right, center center. They like the power of the identity of being a centrist, but that identity doesn't carry with it any ideology, any vision. So if being a centrist doesn't mean I have a centrist view regarding the conflict, it just means I don't have a view regarding the conflict. I think the most important move we should do in Israel today is a paradigm shift in the center. It's turning an indifferent center into a pragmatic center. A center that doesn't care about the conflict, but a center that passionately cares about the conflict. You see, being a moderate should mean, I'm saying this, now I'm saying this out loud because I think this has, Americans should hear this too. We should hear this too. And the world is just so polarized because the right is becoming so extreme and the left is so extreme. What enables polarization is that the center is so indifferent. Well, what happens if the center becomes passionate? That's how you heal societies. You heal societies not by making the left less extreme or the right less extreme, but making the center more passionate. That's my theory. But how do you heal democracies today in the world? But in order to heal the center has to have something it believes in. So creating a passionate center is probably the most healing idea we could think of in this day and age, in Israel, in England, in America, and all over the world. Now, in order to have a passionate center, you have to have like a vision for the center. What would a vision for the center look like? So there's so many issues. And the center, by the way, the center, there's room for people on the right in the center, the left in the center. It's a very big camp of people that are asking a new question. Not who's right, but what works. That's the shift from the politics of ideologies to the politics of pragmatism. Let's ask just one question: what works? And here's the thing: what works? I want to buy. As I opened, I was very honest, and I realized some people are upset. I opened with why I'm against annexation. I think it's not smart. All right, I made the argument. But I do want to take something from the spirit of annexation, and that is the idea of unilateralism. I think the idea that we shouldn't just wait for the Middle East to cure itself and start moving things forward, I think that's a good idea. And unilateralism is a good idea. I'm just not sure that a unilateral move that has only one ingredient, which is annexation, is a good idea. But the idea of a unilateral move where Israel takes initiative, starts moving things forward, I think that's a very good idea. Now, what would a unilateral move look like? Okay, so here I want to introduce a concept which I'm fighting for and spreading for over a year. It's the following concept: shrink the conflict. Shrink the size of the conflict. Let me explain. The left always speaks about solving the conflict. Let's just end the conflict. The right, or not all the right, but like the BB right, also Boogie is actually on this camp, is about sustaining things the way they are. It has a word: managing the conflict. Now, the left is about ending the conflict. The right is about managing the conflict. The left is about transforming the status quo. The right is about sustaining the status quo. Now, there's a problem. Both are wrong. The left wants to end the conflict, but we can't end the conflict. We just can't. The right wants to sustain the status quo, but the status quo is not sustainable. But are those the only options we have? That's binary thinking. That's a false dichotomy. Imagine somebody will tell you that car accidents are dangerous, and therefore we should end car accidents. We should end car accidents. And he has a great plan. He or she have a great plan to end car accidents. And then somebody else says, well, we can't end car accidents. That's not going to happen. So what's the plan? Not to do anything about it. Now, obviously, the alternative to ending car accidents is not doing anything about it. Let me give you another example. Somebody has an idea how to end crime. We'll just do like these 5 things and crime will vanish, it will end. And the other person is saying, on the other side of the debate, is saying, well, we can't end crime. We can't, so let's not doing anything about it. Now, when it comes to crime, when it comes to car accidents, when it comes to everything, we don't think that way. We don't think there's a way to end a problem, and we never think that the alternative to ending the problem is not doing anything about the problem. When it comes to the conflict, suddenly we think that way exactly. Either you end the problem or you don't do anything about it. Those are the options we have. And when those are the options we have, our mind is trapped in a market of ideas, it's a poverty of ideas. We need a new idea in the market of ideas. We need to think about the conflict like we think about everything else. We can't end it, but it doesn't mean there's nothing we can do about it. There is a lot we can do about it. We can shrink it. Shrink the size of the conflict. Dramatically shrink the size of the conflict. And let's start tomorrow morning. Let's start tonight. Let's start right now, moving forward towards shrinking the size of the conflict. How would that look like? Here's how it won't look like. It won't look like a grand agreement, people shaking hands on the White House lawn and a Nobel Prize. It won't be something utopian, it won't be that exciting moment we had in Camp David. That's not how it's, or in Jordan. That's not how it's going to look like. It won't be a grand plan. It's going to be small steps. Now, think about small steps. Small steps, many of them unilateral. Every small step doesn't do much, but the sum of small steps does a lot. Think about, instead of the impact of a grand plan, the impact of the sum of many small steps. Now, what kind of small steps am I talking about? I'm talking about every step has to have 2 characteristics. 1, it shrinks the amount of military control Israel has over Palestinians. 2, it doesn't shrink the amount of security Israelis have. Any step that shrinks occupation without shrinking security, when I say occupation, that's what I mean. I don't mean occupation over the land. I mean military control over civilian population. Any step that shrinks occupation without shrinking security is a step we should do unilaterally and tomorrow morning. Now, I wrote an article, and I want to invite you all to read this article in The Atlantic magazine, I think it was a year ago, called 8 Steps to Shrink the Conflict. That's why I started developing this idea. 8 steps to shrink the conflict. I think if we do all 8 steps, the conflict will shrink from like the size of 80 to the size of 20. Occupation will shrink dramatically. Israeli security won't. It won't end the conflict. It will change it. It will shrink it. And it's the optimization of what most Israelis want. Today, I think there's not 8 steps. There's like 30 steps, 40 steps. We have to figure them out. But this paradigm, I want to that we're moving from, that we need a passionate center. 1, the passionate center needs a vision, and it's not indifference, but pragmatism. 2, pragmatism looks like not ending the conflict, but shrink it. 3, and you shrink it through the sum of small steps. 4, that's a vision for a center. Passionate center, thinking pragmatically, not being indifferent, and it's shrinking the conflict through many small steps that we start doing tomorrow morning. That's already, I think, an interesting vision for the center. Now I know people are having questions. What do these steps look like? So let me just give you an example of a step, okay? Let me give you an example of a step. 1 out of 8 steps I have in the Atlantic article, but like I think 20, 30 steps, because it's interesting when you write something, so it triggers a conversation and people say, hey, we could do this also, we could do that also. And I've spoken to many, many people on all ranks in the Israeli society, Palestinian society. I think we've come up with a nice plan to shrink the conflict. But that's not enough, right? Because many people, but it won't bring peace. Yes, we have to not expect to have peace. But we can't expand settlements. Okay, so we have to give up the dream. We have to give up all our dreams. The dream of sacred peace and sacred land, and to move from great dreams to effective actions on the. Okay, so let me just, what do I mean? The situation in the West Bank today is not good. It's not good, and for many reasons, I'm not going to go into it now. And it's very worthwhile speaking to Tal Becker about this, about how, why is the situation in the West Bank so dysfunctional today? And it has everything to do with Oslo. But I won't go into the reasons because we don't have a lot of time. But in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank today, there is Palestinian Authority that has a certain level of autonomy. That autonomy is broken into 160 territorial islands of autonomy, and those islands are not connected to each other. Now, what does this mean? This means that you're a Palestinian living in one autonomy, and you want to go visit a cousin living in another autonomy. For example, let's say you're living in Ramallah, and you want to visit a cousin of yours up north in Nablus. So Ramallah is a Palestinian autonomy. Nablus is a Palestinian autonomy, but they're not connected to each other. And in between, we have what we call Area C, which is area controlled by the Israeli military. Which means if you want to travel from Ramallah to Nablus, you have to move through Area C. And that means a lot of things. That means you'll experience discrimination, humiliation, you can't predict your ride, there might be a lot of things. It also means, by the way, that on that road, you'll feel controlled by the Israeli military regime. But also something else. What's the level of governance of the Palestinian Authority? If you want to send a cop from Nablus to Ramallah, that cop will go through Area C. They need Israelis' authority to enable that. So the fact that the Palestinian islands are not connected to each other has 2 implications. 1, that's where massive experience of occupation takes place. Palestinians feel like they're controlled by a military regime. 2, the governance of the Palestinian autonomy is limited and crippled because it can't control all those islands without always needing Israel to enable their movement. So they did this in Oslo, and there was the idea, well, Oslo was only for 5 years. After 5 years, it'll be a state, it'll all be connected, everything is okay. The state didn't come. We could go into the history why it didn't come and start blaming people, but that's not constructive. There is no state, and the impermanent situation became permanent. And as a result, there's 169 autonomies not connected to each other. Why don't we connect them? Why don't we just start a project of connecting them tomorrow morning? And there is a lot of plans to do this. And it looks something like this. You build, I'll give you an example. This is one step out of 8 steps, but it's a very important step. You build a territorial corridor that connects all those islands to each other. And the heart of that corridor, there's a road, and the sovereignty over that corridor will be Palestinian. Just imagine, just try to imagine, you're a Palestinian living in Ramallah, and you want to go to Nablus. There's a corridor that's just Palestinian that you drive through, and it's you're in Palestine when you're on that road. So you look to your right, that might be to your right, Area C. You look to your left, it's Area C. But the road is Palestinian. And the cop that will give you a report is Palestinian police. So you're not, so suddenly the government of the Palestinian Authority jumps to the sky because it has now full control over all the autonomy. The experience of being controlled by the Israeli regime shrinks dramatically because you could drive from Hebron in the south all the way to Jenin up north and be only in Palestinian roads. And they will have a hard time with this, but it doesn't risk Israeli security. This is an idea that's been checked again and again by the most conservative Israeli thinkers and generals. So here's a step. It's a small step to connect all Palestinian autonomies to each other. Occupation shrinks dramatically. Security doesn't shrink at all. Let's do that tomorrow morning. Why aren't we doing that? Now there's more steps. You have to also connect, after you create freedom of movement, you have to somehow connect the Palestinian Authority to the world. You have to connect their economy to the world. There's more steps we have to do in order to dramatically start increasing their autonomy, their governance, their ability to govern themselves, and shrinking Israeli occupation without shrinking Israeli security. Now, the right is always against because, we can't give land to Palestinians and this road is land and we shouldn't give in and we shouldn't show weak. Fine. We understand why the right is against. The interesting thing is the left is many times against. And there's two flavors to the rejection of the left. One, we'll do this when we want peace. We want a 2-state solution. And all this we'll do once we have peace. And here's the problem, and here's the irony. Here's the irony. There's a problem being trapped in narratives. Here's the irony. If we only do these steps on the ground when we have peace, peace that's not coming means no steps on the ground, which means the myth of peace is freezing the status quo. This is an important takeaway of this lecture. I hope you understand this. Not only the myth of sacred land is freezing the status quo, it's also the myth of peace that's freezing the status quo. Because the only moves we'll do is when we have peace. Peace that's not coming means no moves. Pragmatic, which means, my argument is let's turn the whole thing around. It's not the center, which is not pragmatic, which is paralyzed. It's the right and the left that are paralyzed. If you believe in sacred land, you can't move forward. If you believe in sacred peace, you don't move forward. But it's only when you move from ideologies to pragmatism, from narratives to steps, can you start moving forward, which means it's not this today, it's a center that's paralyzed because it's indifferent. When the center becomes pragmatic, we're out of paralysis. So that was one example of one step, but I wanted to prove through that step that it's possible. I know it's possible. And I've studied these steps in the past month very deeply. I know it's possible. And not only that it's possible, this also proves that there is an unspoken alliance between the settlement movement and the peace movement. Because without knowing, and without being aware, these are two ideologies freezing the status quo. But since most Israelis don't buy both ideologies today, I think there's potential for start to buying a real move that shrinks occupation, even if it doesn't end it, without shrinking security, breaking the status quo, which is frozen, and starting to